Welcome to BizTech's Leadership Conversation Show. Now, this show today is part of our partnership with the Malaysian Business Angels Network Summit 2022, which takes place on the 23rd and 24th of June. Our guest today is Dan Toma. He's the founder of Outcome and also co-author of the award-winning book, The Corporate Startup. Now, The Corporate Startup is a practical guide for established companies that aspire to develop and sustain their innovation capabilities. Now, to tell us more, welcome to the show, Dan.
Thank you very much for having me.
Dan, first of all, could you tell us a little bit about your background and what Outcome does?
Sure. Actually, my background is in entrepreneurship. So I started my first company when I was 19. Currently, I'm actually working in consultancy. I have my own company. And what we are doing at Outcome, we are helping large organizations transform, essentially helping them become more suited for the innovation world and the digital world we live in, helping them with things like strategy, helping them with things like transformation, but also with capability development.
So then how does your approach at Outcome differ from other consulting companies that also preach the innovation and transformation mantra?
We typically embed ourselves with the client. We always keep saying that we work with the client and not for the client, meaning that the hand-holding process is very embedded in everything we do. We don't just present a PowerPoint and then we leave people to their own ability to develop or deliver on those promises in the PowerPoint, but we're actually hand-holding them and co-developing to some extent capability together with the client, because I know from experience that every organization is different. You might be active in the same industry as your competitors, but you are probably 90% different than your competitors. So it's important that every intervention is tailored to the actual need of the patient, not just something that it's written in the book or can be copied from across the street.
Okay, now I want to take one step back then, and what inspired the three of you to write the book, The Corporate Startup?
I think, at least for me, I'm going to talk for me, less for my co-authors. For me, was frustration was probably the word that drives me to write the book. I was actually at the time employed by a large telecommunication company in Germany, working in their innovation department. And I realized back then how backwards their processes were when it comes to developing digital ventures and develop innovation. And by backwards, I don't mean slow or outdated. They were literally backwards. They were starting from a business plan, investing a lot of money up front, only to develop for a year, only to realize that, hey, the clients don't actually want that solution and they want something entirely different. This was in stark contrast to what I was used to in the startup world that I was coming from. So I started documenting the journey of convincing the organization and the steps that we were making to change the organization and have a more leaner process, if you want. And that transformed into a blog, and then the blog transformed into conferences, and conferences transformed into a book a couple of years later. Along the journey, I met my co-authors. They were experiencing the same thing with their own practices and their own experiences in different industries throughout the world.
So essentially what the three of you got together to do is companies need to innovate or die. They need a playbook. Basically, you've given them a playbook to follow in terms of how to start this innovation journey and see it through. Now, tell us about some of the key ideas in the book.
Yeah, essentially in the book, we are outlining a system for innovation. We came to the book by saying, hey, stop thinking about innovation as being an island in the sun or just a job of a handful of people in your organization. Think of innovation as being everybody's job in the organization. Some people might have it higher on the agenda, some people might have it lower on the agenda, but still everybody's job. And since it is everybody's job, let's create a system that's able to bring out innovation in the people throughout the organization. So we're talking about how do we integrate strategy with practice? How do we integrate practice with management? How does everything fit into the cultural context of the organization? And lastly, how can leadership actually help to support that development of the culture, but also the development and catering for the innovation system?
Now, the corporate startup, you basically provide frameworks, you provide visualization, templates, tools, and methods to really help these companies develop new products and business models. Because it is really hard, isn't it? You're trying to run your core business, and then you're also trying to develop new markets and products. Walk us through the teaching methodology around the book and give us some insights into the toolkits to help these companies really become better innovators.
Right. In essence, what you highlighted is a problem that's recognized around the world and across industries. This is not just specific to pharma or specific to telco or specific to Malaysia or Europe or the US. This is something that organizations are facing around the world. They are faced with a dilemma. What do I do when I come into the office every day as a leader of an organization, as CEO of an organization? What do I do? Do I cater for the core business that's keeping the lights on, providing with the salaries for the people that we have employed today, or do I just focus on the future technologies, future business model, things that are going to come in the future in our region, in our company, or in our industry? And that's a dilemma that leaders face around the world. The thing is that there is no one answer to that. You can't do one and not do the other. You have to have a mix. So in the book, we're actually presenting various tools that people can use on how to deal with that dilemma, and not just how to deal with it, but how to deal efficiently with that dilemma. So for example, in one of the chapters, we discuss about the product lifecycle process and how to design one. That's a key component for every organization that wants to particularly develop new ideas while at the same time still exploiting the ideas that are already profitable, the business models they've been doing for years, in some cases even hundreds of years. If you're looking at an automotive company, for example, right, they've been building cars for hundreds of years, and now all of a sudden they are faced with people no longer wanting to buy cars. They have to manage that in a proper way. And for example, the product lifecycle that I just mentioned is helping organizations do exactly that. And then there's plenty of other things in the book. Again, kind of like helping people, giving them a step up, if you want. We're not saying that the book is perfect. We're not saying that our thinking is perfect, but it's a good starting point for most leaders. And then it's going to be up to customize and to tailor those things to their specific situation within their companies, to their specific context, if you want.
So Dan, could you give us some success stories of how companies have perhaps used your book and tools to innovate by either developing new products or new business models or entering new markets?
Yeah, I think equally interesting is to also discuss about the let's say failures that organizations had, and the fact that they were able to spot dead end roads very early on. I think that's also a way to measure success. Instead of overly investing in something that might not work in the future, how do we kill stuff that doesn't have that potential? How do we kill it early on, and how do we kill it with efficiency? We were working at one point with a bank in Norway. It was the largest bank in Norway, and I think the second largest, or still the largest in Scandinavia. A name that's probably not familiar to people in Malaysia, so I'm not going to even bother mentioning it. It was a local bank, but it was still big in terms of size, at least for the European size benchmark, if you want. So we were working with them on this transformation, and I think that after 3 years of having worked with them, we got them to a point where they were able to try out a new innovation strategy every 8 months. So every 8 months, they were creating a new perspective of what the future might look like for banking, and they were able to put that immediately into practice. And as a result of their efforts, as a result of the capability we developed with them, in 8 months' time, they were able to get very clear data whether or not that particular strategy will work out, whether or not they should continue investing in those initiatives, or they will need to reassess their situation, reassess where they want to head. Specifically, we were working with them, I think in 2017 or early 2018, on a project around banking for wearable devices that was deemed at the time to be game-changing for banking. I'm not saying that it didn't end up being game-changing, but probably the impact was overly emphasized at that time versus to what the reality ended up being 3-4 years later. But in any case, they said that the banking for wearables is very important. And then they started investing a lot in internal ventures and external ventures that have to do with wearables, only to learn that the market doesn't behave in the way that their strategy stipulated. So immediately after 8 months, they were able to pull the plug on everything that has to do with banking for wearables. And instead, they decided to partner rather than build solutions. They decided to partner with Apple to bring Apple Pay in the country. That was very smart because their initial strategy had to do with a lot of building of infrastructure, building of banking infrastructure, building of devices even. And then once they saw that people don't react to that in a positive way, they said it's better to just partner with somebody that has everything figured out, and that in that case was Apple Pay. So this was one of the many examples that I'm able to share with you.
So, interestingly enough, Dan, I as you were explaining this, I'm thinking about some Malaysian examples that literally have unfolded over the last 18 months. So about in 2020, because of that, the 2020, 2021, there was a supernormal demand globally for gloves, rubber gloves, and because of basically of the COVID situation. So you had a lot of companies who were not in the business suddenly rushing into the gloves and the masks business. Today, it's 2022. They're swimming in a sea of red. They're trying to get rid of those businesses because prices of gloves have collapsed. And so this is an example completely to show how your startup methodology and really testing it out. And what amazed me is you said that the bank is now in 8-month cycle. You literally should be doing your POCs, your proof of concepts and stress testing your new business models and stuff like that before actually spending a lot of money. And so these are real examples in Malaysia, really, of how companies have got it completely wrong.
And Malaysia is not different from any other country. Germany is the same, UK is the same. There's so many examples of companies that have failed at the startup game, if you want. And it doesn't matter if it was triggered by COVID or it was pre-COVID. Essentially, the game was the same. Probably the topic changed throughout the pandemic.
So speaking of the pandemic, now the pandemic was a very interesting period in, I think, will be looked back in history, where companies were forced to innovate and transform at a pace that was unprecedented in history. What are some of your key observations that you've made in terms of the pace of innovation during this time?
Yeah, first of all, I would say that through our practice and through the engagements that we had with our clients, we saw two types of organizations. There were organizations that took the pandemic as an opportunity to double down on their initial innovation investments. They already had plenty of capability and they said, hey, this is the greatest moment in our past 20 years when we need to double click on innovation. We need to double our investment in innovation because that's the only way we can survive in the future. And there were organizations that unfortunately before the pandemic haven't seen much results from innovation, and they consider innovation as being a cost center and they deprioritized innovation entirely. We worked with clients of both kinds. Obviously, the ones that doubled down, I think they are now in a better position than the ones that closed down their innovation efforts. We worked with clients that were totally not digital or didn't have any new business models before the pandemic, and now their portfolio is very diverse. Obviously, time will tell how many of those initiatives are actually going to be profitable, but at least they took the first step into diversifying their portfolio of business models.
Now, speaking of diversifying of the portfolio of business models, have companies become better as a result of the pandemic of perhaps incubating new concepts or spinning off startups, or perhaps even then, for some companies, that's a smarter way of doing it, investing in new startups so that they at least have diversification of risk and also are able to try different things really from a low cost perspective?
Yeah, I think some of the organizations are getting better, but the ones that are getting better were the ones that got better were the ones that already started before the pandemic. I think for the organizations that haven't started before the pandemic, now they are realizing the importance. The pandemic showed them, gave them a cold shower, if you want. Show them, guys, this is what you need to be focusing on in the future. This is innovation is a business imperative, not just a nice to have. As I said, the organizations that already did it before the pandemic were probably the organizations that throughout the pandemic had to double down because they already had the capability, they already had the know-how, they already knew the benefits. The pandemic just accelerated their pace of investment. The organizations that haven't started, they realized, shit, we need to start doing it now because otherwise, look what's happening, right? They were faced essentially with a problem that it had absolutely no solution for. They had absolutely no capability, expertise for. Essentially, it's like you're seeing the hurricane coming, and all of a sudden you are faced with, I need to build myself a shelter. But in the past 3-5 years, you haven't put your hands on a shovel in your life, actually. So you don't know exactly what it means to build something, or to dig a hole, or to put a roof, or do some pillars that sustain a building. People that had that experience before the hurricane, people that were used to digging holes and stuff like that, were in a better position than people that didn't have that experience.
Could you give us some examples maybe of industries or companies that you think maybe have missed the boat during this period?
I think that the entire travel and holiday industry is pretty backwards. They suffered obviously a lot in the pandemic. I'm not going to downplay the impact that pandemic had on companies like Singapore Airlines or Qatar Airways or Lufthansa, right? I'm not going to downplay that. But I'm just going to ask myself and ask the executives there, guys, what have you done in the years previous to the pandemic? And what, if you haven't done anything, what were the lessons learned from the pandemic? How are you future-proofing your organization as a result of the lessons learned from the pandemic? Because just reducing costs, just managing your organization with an Excel sheet and driving costs down is not going to make you resilient in the face of a new crisis in the future. And the beauty, if you want, of the world we live in is we don't know what the next crisis is going to look like. You might just get prepared for a pandemic, but the crisis might be of a different kind in the future. And we're seeing it now with the situation in Ukraine, with the prices of energy going up. This is totally different than the pandemic. Are you prepared to cope with that situation better than you were with the pandemic? What have you done to become a resilient organization, essentially?
Now, and you made a very good point there about the situation in Ukraine. If we take a helicopter view of the global economic, geopolitical, and social concerns, we see a common thread really now, which is really about uncertainty and constant change. What are your thoughts on this? And how can we thrive instead of just surviving against all this turbulence?
Yeah, I think very important for leaders nowadays is to stop asking the wrong questions. By the wrong question, I mean, instead of asking yourself, how do we deal with COVID, or how do we deal with an increase of prices in energy, or how do we increase with the price of food going up, or with inflation, they should probably ask themselves a different question. That question is, how do I build a capability that is going to ensure that no matter what the crises of the future are going to look like, I am still in a really good position to adapt and overcome those challenges. So instead of playing the crisis, try to look inside the organization and create the capabilities, create the system that's going to prevent you from going into a crisis to begin with. And second, create the capabilities and systems that are going to be able to cope with any kind of crisis. It's very important to not play the opponent's team's game, but to play your own game, if I may use like a football metaphor or a sports metaphor, right? Great football teams, great tennis players don't focus that much on playing the opponent as much as they focus on playing their own game and their own style. If you look at top tennis players, they all win because they don't focus on the opponent. They focus on their own style, getting better with their own style, getting better with their own tactics, and then have the opponent essentially cope with their tactics, cope with their way of playing the game. It's very important not to play the crisis and play the system. Think of your organization as the system. Try to improve that system, because no matter what's going to come in the future, and we don't know what's going to come in the future, your organization will be really good suited to deal with that if you emphasize the role of capability, if you emphasize the role of the system.
Dan, that's great advice, because, you know, it's around playing to your strengths, and that's playing your own game, I think, is a key takeaway. If there's one thing you take away from this today, is that play your own game. Dan, it's been a fascinating conversation, but before we leave, any final thoughts you'd like to leave us in the audience with before we end?
Yeah, I would say that something that you already mentioned, that the only constant now, the only certainty in the world now is uncertainty. So I think that's very important for people, you know, to internalize, take home, and start acting on that.
Now, Dan, thank you very much for taking your time to come on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to meeting you and others in the conference coming up next week.
Now, I'm Brian Fernandez, and we've been speaking to Dan Toma, founder of Outcome and author of award-winning book, The Corporate Startup, on BizTech's Leadership Conversation show. This conversation is part of our partnership with the Malaysian Business Angels Network Summit 2022, which takes place on the 23rd and 24th of June. This video and podcast will also be on our social media platforms, as well as our website, www.biztech.asia. Please subscribe and like our various platforms. Thanks again for tuning in.